delighted to be here today. I am very, very glad to be in Australia because I love Australia. I happen to be married to an Australian, and he is, well, I guess I can call him quite magnificent. He's all Australian, and he's at home because he forgot to apply for his landed immigrant status, and so he couldn't come here with me. And so this is the first time that I have actually been away from my husband for any extended time in all the time that we've been married. So when I get messages from him, it goes something like this. There's 4 weeks and 2 days before you're home. And then the next one is there's 3 weeks and 5 days until you're home. And I think he might be missing me. I'm certainly missing him. You know, I don't know any of you hardly at all, although I've met you a few times coming to church. And you don't know me. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was not raised as a Seventh-day Adventist. My father became an Adventist when I was 16 years old, and as a result of that, my mother left my father. She did not want to be a part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and so I became the individual that made the homemade bread, which I can remember baking bread, and the first batch of bread I made, I wanted it to be really good, so I made raisin bread, and it raised so high in the oven that it touched the top of the oven and burnt, and the raisins all popped out into the bottom of the oven and they burnt, and so the house was full of smoke. But my father was such a wonderful man. When he saw how hard I tried to make bread, he said, "Oh, that is wonderful. We'll just cut that part off," he said. And he just said it, and he sliced it, and he buttered it, and he put it in his mouth, and he said, "This is delicious." And, you know, fathers are so important. When you are growing up, your father is probably the most important person next to your mother. But he's the one that brings the healing within the home. And he's the one that sets the tone of the home. And God is so wise when he gives men leadership qualities and women the nurturing qualities, so that when we recognize where our children are and what's happening with them, we can kind of tip our leadership partner off, and they can, you know, back us up and do all kinds of things. And God planned it that way. He planned a home to be united in the way that we raise our families. And it's wonderful. I love, you know, for years I did family counseling. I also worked with people that were struggling in their relationships, and I loved working with men because I had such a good father that I have a huge respect for men. And I believe in the calling that men have and how that men need to step up into the high calling that God has given them. And that women need to honor them and respect them. And, you know, when it says, husbands, love your wives, it also talks about what the relationship that a woman needs to have with a man and how important that is for her to respect him and to honor him. The other thing that I've done is I have painted a series of paintings of Jesus Christ. And that came about by a series of miracles that led me to believe that God wanted me to do that job, because I did not like the image that people had. the visual images that people had of God. When I grew up, I can remember not knowing God. And I also remember seeing pictures, and a lot of them were either totally expressionless or grumpy. And I didn't know for sure what God was like. And so when I was called to do paintings of Jesus, I wanted them to be full of joy and full of passion and strength. You do not have to compromise either of those in order to include them in a portrait of Christ. One of the other things I did when I was painting was I painted a mural. It was 56 feet long. It took me 4.5 years to complete, and it was on the plan of salvation. So from Eden all the way to Eden Restored. It was an enormous undertaking. When I was asked to do it, I thought, no, I'm not doing this, but God brought me right onto my knees and said, you have to do this. I had no idea why I had to paint that mural, but I spent all of my spare time for 4.5 years doing it. But when I started, I had to really struggle in order to do anything that looked good. But by the time I got to the life of Christ, I was painting freely, and I had agonized through the process and said, God, you've given me the job. You have to give me the wisdom and the power to do it. And he did. He gave me the ability to paint. So that if you spend hours looking at the face of Jesus on the cross, and you may be I was dotting a highlight in his eye, and then taking another color and cutting that dot in half in order to get exactly the kind of passion, the kind of feeling. I didn't want to just do a picture. I wanted it to convey the character of God. So one particular scene that I painted in the life of Christ was Jesus kneeling on the ground beside a leper. And he had scooped this leper up into his arms, and he was healing this man who had fingers missing and one leg was missing from the knee down. He was parts of his face had slothed away. I even painted the flies on him. I wanted people to understand that Christ was willing to touch the untouchable. And I also had a really good friend whose son was dying of AIDS, and I painted that scene especially for her because of the grief that she was going through. As I painted, I began to think of my own life, and I thought, you know, God, I am that leper. And I agonized out. I just said, God, I've done everything wrong in my life. I am so sinful. I had envisioned the smell of this man. I envisioned the quality of life that he had, where he was rotting. And I said, God, you know, my sins, they have come up into the nostrils of God. And I wept so much that I had a hard time painting. I couldn't see because of the tears in my eyes. And as I painted, I emptied my soul out to God. When I was finished that scene and I stood back and looked at it to see if everything was exactly the way I wanted it to be, God spoke to me. And he said, I am that leper. It shocked me. It shocked me that he said that to me. Jesus is the leper, he repeated. And then he quoted this verse. He became sin who knew no sin, that we might be the righteousness of God in him. I could hardly breathe thinking about what God had spoke to me. It was so amazing. It was so far beyond what I could ever have thought of Christ. And it reminds me of the experience of Isaiah. And I want you to turn to the 6th chapter of Isaiah. In this chapter, which I may not read this, I may just talk about what is found in there. But in the 6th chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah has a vision, and it takes place in the year that King Uzziah died. And he sees the Lord in the temple, high and lifted up, and his whole train filled the temple as he sits on this throne, and all the angels are around him. These angels have 6 wings. Some covered their faces, some covered their feet, and others they used to fly. And they began to cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." And as they shout out this praise to God, the posts in the temple begin to move with a magnificent power of praise as these beings praise God with all their might and strength. And as Isaiah sees this taking place, he is so undone. He said, "Oh God, how can I be here?" I'm imagining him saying, "I'm a man of unclean lips. How can I be in your presence? God, I'm in the very presence. I'm in the throne room of heaven. How can I be in this place? I'm unclean, and I'm from a whole nation of unclean people." And the angels see his distress, and one angel takes the tongs and he goes onto the altar and he takes a live coal off the altar, and he goes over to Isaiah and he places that coal on his lips, and he says, "You're healed." And then there's a call. God says, "Who will go for us? Who will speak for us?" And immediately Isaiah says, "I will go. I will go." God has a call for you. God has a call for every person in this room. There is not one person that God has not called for one particular person, reason or another. Had he called Isaiah, and Isaiah responded immediately. But have you noticed what message God gives Isaiah? You have probably heard that story before. But what is the message? God says, "Go to this people. Go to this people. Hearing ye indeed, but understand not. See ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of this people fat. Make their ears heavy. Shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and convert, and be healed." As I worked as a counselor, I found out that a lot of people shut down because of trauma. I remember a woman who had been beaten so much on her shoulders and forearms that she could stick a pin in her arm and not feel it, because the sensory receptors in her arms had been so traumatized by her mother's beatings. She no longer had the sense of touch in this area of her body. I remember a story of two little boys. One was 2 years old, one 4. Their parents were having a terrible fight. It increased to such a state that they sent these two little boys downstairs. And as they were downstairs, the argument escalated to the point that the father drew a gun and shot the mother. And then, realizing what he had done, he turned the gun and shot himself. Now these boys screamed for hours, and the neighbors finally heard these little boys, and they found them there, screaming, 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 and they were taken into care. Within 24 hours, that 4-year-old was deaf, could no longer hear. However, he had an ear infection, and they treated the ear infection, and he regained that small amount of his hearing. Isn't it amazing what the brain will do? How that child was so traumatized by his own screaming, his brother's screaming, and the sounds of the argument, the sounds of the gun, that his hearing was seared off. He no longer could hear. But for all intents and purposes, he was totally deaf until they treated the ear infection and regained a small amount of his hearing. Isaiah talks about people who don't hear and don't really see. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 13, verse 13, quotes Isaiah and refers to the nation of Israel as being unable to hear, unable to see, unable to receive information. Paul also did the same thing in Acts chapter 28, verse 26 and 27. And he quotes that, and he says that if we would see, if we would hear, if our hearts that are hard would be softened and be not so hard, that God would heal us, and we would be converted. And you know, that totally amazed me, that God would equate healing on that level with conversion. And it got my interest up. Well, when I went to school and I took my training as a counselor, I learned that people do actually shut down. I'm wondering if you are aware that we can shut ourselves down in all sorts of ways. Number one, by trauma, which I've just described, but also by some things that we do. We can shut ourselves down. Let me use the example of pornography. When men get into pornography and they view what normally would be an experience shared with someone, but they're not sharing it with them, they're only involved in it in a solo experience. What happens in the brain is that the brain says, oh, you should be intimate right now. This is intimacy, right? So therefore, you should be connecting with someone, but there isn't anybody there to connect with. And so one of the most major and destructive situations that happen to men who have been involved in pornography actually has a brain damaging effect. And that is that it destroys their ability to have empathy. Over and over again, there's nothing shared. Over and over again, like that girl who had been hit again and again, the perceptions shut down. And so in the brain, when you're supposed to be sharing something on an intimate level, There is no more connecting taking place for an experience that should be a connecting experience. And men actually become incapable of having empathy. That is a serious thing. Do you know that 8 out of 10 divorces that take place within the church, as well as within the world, 8 out of 10 divorces have a pornography factor. Now, if that doesn't shock you, I don't know what will. It shocked me when I found out. 8 out of 10 have a pornography factor. So the idea that a person is involved in pornography and they're not hurting anybody because they're doing this all by themselves, and therefore, you know, there's no accountability, there's no responsibility, is quite false. Can you imagine how many thousands upon probably millions of people that use pornography today? Can you imagine the effect it is having on our planet and on the next generation? That is serious to think of. That no longer can a father relate to his children. No longer does he relate to his wife. He is incapable of putting himself in their shoes. Empathy means that you can imagine what someone else is going through. And he's incapable of doing that. I want to talk about that a little more this afternoon. I also want to talk about solution. I do not believe for a second that I will do one single bit of good to anyone in this room if I only talk about a problem. I am very solution-based. I want to see results. I want answers. Do you want answers? We want answers, don't we? We want to know what we can do about problems. We don't want to just hear about the problem all over again. Nobody ever solved a problem by looking at the problem. We only solve it by looking at the solution. And so today I want to give you a solution that is simply magnificent in my eyes. In fact, right now, as I'm talking about it, I'm getting goosebumps because I love the gospel. I love what the gospel has to give us. I prayed for more than 2 years because I took my training not as a Christian in a Christian college. I took my training in a worldly facility, and I prayed for 2 years that God would give me a formula that would totally embrace the Christian beliefs that I love, and that it would honor God, and that it would take me out of the picture, and that only God would be the one who would be doing the counseling. And he gave me that formula. And it is so amazing. I want to share part of it this morning with what time I have left, and then this afternoon I want to give you some tools. I want us to have some fun this afternoon with what we do, and I want you to come and see what God has in mind. Now, let me ask for these handouts to be placed in your hands. And as they are doing that, I will begin to talk about it because I don't have a lot of time here. And in fact, I was rather wondering how on earth I was going to share this material with you, because when I'm at what you call big camp meeting in British Columbia, Canada, I have a week to present this material. And here I'm doing it in 2 short segments, and of course I can't cover it all. And so I'm hoping that you will forgive me, that I'm not giving you all that I could give you, but I'll give you what I can in order for you to receive a blessing and to have some wonderful tools. and to understand God more. You know, in painting pictures, you would think that being an artist wouldn't have anything to do with counseling at all. How wrong that is. You know that I found out that when I studied the muscles on a face, well, they were sitting across from me, and I would see a little muscle going in and out, and I'd think to myself, that person's under tension. What's going on there? What do I need to ask God? I would pray and say, God, tell me what to say. Tell me how to help this person. Show me what you want to do with this individual. And God was the counselor. I wasn't the counselor at all. Anytime that I didn't pray, I didn't have success. But when I asked God to do the work, God never let me down. Never. Just briefly, as you've got this in your hand, you'll see that it says at the top, triggered feelings. Triggered feelings are a result of something that's familiar either in your past or some situation that arouses your emotion. In the case of Adam and Eve, it was their own sin that triggered the feelings, right? You see, as soon as Adam disobeyed, what was the feeling he had? Guilt. What did he do with guilt? You see, if you have guilt all the time and you're running on guilt, something's got to change because you can't handle that. We're not made to handle guilt. Do you know we're not created for sin? We're created for divine intervention. We're created for God to give us the most positive experience. He never created us for sin. And so when we experience something like guilt, we are not prepared to handle guilt. And so what you do is you use a behavior. And the behavior that Adam used was blaming. He blamed Eve. When God said, did you do it? He said, the woman that you gave me, she gave it to me, then I ate it. He finally admitted he ate it, but only after he blamed. When they discovered something had happened to them, the light went out inside of them, you know. They were clothed in the glory of God in the beginning, and the light went out. And they saw they were naked and they were ashamed, and what did they do? They covered themselves with fig leaves. But you know what? You don't ever get rid of shame by covering it. Because when God was walking in the garden and they heard his voice calling out to them, they ran away because they were naked. They were covered. Technically speaking, they had on their fig leaves, but in fact, they were naked in the presence of the living God. I want to quote a 4-year-old who had been sexually abused, who shared this with me. She said, I felt like a light had gone out inside of me. I felt that when I walked into the room, everyone could see me as if I was naked, and that they knew I was dirty and different, and that I would never be okay again. That was her expression. I thought, how like Adam and Eve's experience. Did she do anything wrong? No, she was a victim. And yet she felt the guilt, and she felt the shame, and she felt the fear that no one would ever accept her again, that she'd never be normal, and she acted it out in all kinds of things that she did in her life. And her life was a shipwreck. But I know who's in the lighthouse. And it's awesome to know that there is someone in the lighthouse on the shipwreck of our shore that will take us safely to port. God does not intend for us to operate in guilt and shame and fear. And so he set into plan a most amazing plan called the plan of salvation. Why is it called the plan of salvation? Because it's planned, right? I mean, seriously, we call it the plan of salvation all the time, but we don't think about the fact that it's so deliberate. He was deliberately born out of wedlock. Oh, that's different. That's called a plan. A plan to be conceived when you're not married? I don't know. That's not really that comfortable. He was born in a village, and raised in a village, rather, that when Nathaniel was told that's where Jesus came from, what was his comment? Yeah, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Sort of like the ghettos, right? That's where Jesus was raised, with a family that didn't understand him. And do you know that there is not one single comment from Jesus' father in the Bible between him and his father? Did you know that? Not one. I always wonder if he was all that close after all. It goes on. He goes to Egypt, comes back, knows exactly what it's like for every individual who's been deported and is not in a familiar culture to the one they've been raised in. Jesus Christ knows what that's like. He knows what it's like to be absolutely unable to move for every person who's paraplegic. Christ has been there and experienced that emotion. Jesus knows what it's like to drown. Every breath that he took on the cross, he had to stand on his feet in order to breathe. He had to pull himself up because he was drowning in his own fluids. Why did God do what he did? Why did he do it? Because it was a plan. In Hebrews, it talks about how we have a high priest that can be touched by the feelings of our infirmities. Because God is not indifferent to our pain. Because God is not indifferent to our lot in life. He sent his son as a helpless babe. And you know, in Isaiah, the 9th chapter, it talks about the titles that Jesus has. Unto us a child is what? Pardon? Born. That's the start of it. He's a helpless individual, a helpless baby. Crystal, what can your baby do today? Just cry, right? When she's hungry, and she does a few other not so good things in her nappies. But really, she's a non-productive little girl at this point because she's helpless. Unto us a child is given. God gave us that to us so that we know He knows what it's like to be utterly and completely helpless. That is a caring God. That is a gospel on a different level, folks. That is a God who isn't standoffish, a God who can be approached, a God you can throw yourself down to and say, Lord, I have blown it again. I need you. And He'll say, it's okay. It's okay. I know where you're at. They provoked me. They slapped me. You know, they tried everything they did to Christ on the cross in order to get him to try and refute his identity. Almost all the attacks in the scene around the cross are on his identity. Listen to them. If you are the Christ, come off the cross. Prophesy who hit you. The implication being, you got to be who you really mean. Otherwise, you're a liar. So prophesy. They were mocking him. But all of the attacks that Satan placed on Jesus Christ during the time of his crucifixion were about his identity. Look at it. Go and read the gospel again and take a look at that and recognize that if he could get him to defend himself, if he could get him to stand up for his own rights, then he could control him. You see, on the chart I've given you, it says that guilt and shame and fear have a behavior. And what Satan does is he hooks into our feelings and he drives our behavior. That's why most of the trauma that people have happens before the age of 12, because as soon as you hit puberty, you have a chemical reaction in the brain, and all the information that you've gathered, even from pre-birth until puberty, your mind says, okay, that's the truth. That's the way I govern my life. And so if someone says to you, you're nothing but a lousy individual, you're never going to amount to anything, you're a lousy person. If you hear that, like, say, from your father or from some person of authority in your life, then you believe it and you act it and you live it. You live that lie. And every time somebody challenges you in that particular area of wounding that you have a reaction to it. That's a triggered feeling that comes up, and immediately you have to fix the feeling with the behavior, because that's the only way we've learned how to do it. But you know what? God has a different way. We do not have to give license to our feelings by fixing them with behaviors. We can do what God wants us to do with them. Wouldn't that be awesome? When you get emotional about something, what do you do with it? Has anyone ever told you what to do with it? Has anyone ever told you what to do with that? No one. That's the truth. And you know what? The gospel is bigger than that. The gospel tells us what to do with it. And I'm going to talk about it this afternoon, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it right now. You see, if you don't want to do the behavior, and it's not acceptable to be, it's impossible to stay guilty and full of fear. You can't operate that way. Any man in this room feel powerful when they're driven by fear? Any woman feel good if she's driven by guilt and shame? The whole cosmetic industry is based on women who do not like the way they look. You see, guilt says, what I did or what I'm doing is not okay. But shame says, who I am is not okay. And so when you don't believe you're okay as a woman, you put on cover girl. Amazing, isn't it? So, if it's not acceptable to have your feelings, or you can't live in those feelings, what you do sometimes is you use anger to fix the feeling. And what anger does is it detaches you from your feelings. And it also detaches everyone else, because you know, if someone's going ballistic and their anger's way out here, and most people don't say, well, you're really hurt right now, when you're blowing off and getting upset, right? They don't say that to you. They don't say you're really hurt, or you feel overwhelmed, or you feel inadequate, or you feel abandoned. They don't say that to you. They say you're angry. And I can guarantee you that if somebody's angry in front of you and you say you're really angry, do you know what it does to anger? It increases it. You better believe I'm angry. And they spew it out some more, you see? So if you want to diffuse the anger of somebody who's acting out in front of you in anger, you guess what their emotion is, and you say, you're feeling hurt, aren't you? And guess what? Anger comes down. Isn't that interesting? Anger comes down because they don't need it. They only need it when they can't deal with the feeling. And when you identify with their feelings, then they don't need the feeling anymore. You can use that, can't you? However, if somebody can't live with their feelings and they're not allowed to be angry, because let's face it, if you're a really good Christian, you shouldn't really be angry, right? Although the Bible does say, be angry and sin not, doesn't it? However, anger that is not dealt with turns into depression. Guilt that is not dealt with turns into shame in 72 hours or less. And I'll tell you how that happens. Supposing I stole something and I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable about that. God has built something into us that says stealing what is not ours is wrong. We have a moral base that God gives us for our own benefit. And so if I don't do anything about it, but I keep saying, you know, that was wrong. I should take it back. I know it's not right. This is wrong. I need to make it right. But we don't. Then what we say to ourselves is, you know, I knew that was wrong. And I should have taken it back, but I didn't. I must be a bad person. You see, it turned from guilt into shame. And the Bible says not to go down. Don't let the sun go down on your wrath. And you know, anger will turn into depression in 24 hours. Not interesting? Unresolved anger. Now, supposing somebody doesn't have the tools to resolve anger. Supposing we don't have the tools to do what we need to do. We just keep acting out or getting on our knees again in the same spot and say, you know what, God, I've done it again. Let me tell you a story about a woman whose husband decided that he would nitpick and agonize and twist and gnarl every last thing that woman did. He picked her apart. He ran her down. He totally obliterated her day after day. And he would do it methodically for 1, 2, 3, 4 hours, however long it took, until that person would blow up and say, all kinds of bad things, calling him, you know the words. And then he would say, see, what kind of Christian do you think you are? You think you're a Christian? You're not a Christian. You know, and he would incite her to anger, and she would eventually take the bait. And then hate herself afterwards because she failed again in exactly the same place because the exact same thing was happening over and over and over again. Well, she got desperate. And she said, God, there's got to be something more than this. More than me going to you every single day for the same kind of sin and asking you for forgiveness for the same kind of thing again. And he led her to open up a little book called Steps to Christ, page 69. Now, I don't have it in front of me because, as you can see, I don't use notes. And on that page it says that we have to give God everything, and he will give us everything. Give him your perplexities. Give him your life. Surrender yourself to him, and let him be your everlasting helper. Let him be your righteousness. Let him take over. And so she decided she would do that. Well, she got the test. It came right on its heels the very next day. And that person started in, and she started feeling this stuff coming up. In fact, she was already swearing inside of her head at this individual, her husband. And she said, and she was just about to spew it out again when she remembered what she'd read the day before. And she began to say, okay, God, I'm giving this to you. I'm giving him to you, and I'm surrendering myself to you. I'm giving you my mouth. And she turned around, and this person was still doing this. And half of what he said was the truth, and the rest of it was fabrication. And she focused on the truth, and she said, you know what? You're right. And she quoted the truth part of it. And it was like somebody stuck a balloon in this baboon. And he just went, and it was over. And this person said it was like she had warm oil poured down her back. She was free for the first time in her life because she had given what she would normally have put out this direction. She'd given it to God. And God filled her with his Holy Spirit. And it's as simple as that, folks. Jesus came here so that we would be safe. In Isaiah, he's called Wonderful. Who's wonderful? Do you know somebody wonderful in your life? Are they safe? The person that's wonderful to you, is that person safe? Of course. They're wonderful. They have to be safe, right? They're wonderful. That's the title given to Jesus because it's the very first step in healing emotionally and spiritually. When we understand how wonderful God is, when we understand that he was willing to humiliate himself in order that you would be saved. He would rather die than have you lost. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Counselor. You know what a counselor does? A counselor has to put themselves in someone else's shoes to the point that they can voice what that other person feels. That's the job of the counselor. Once you feel that you have been connected to, you're able to let it go outward, and then you don't carry it anymore. Did Jesus do that? These are his titles. This is him we're talking about. Oh, did he ever? In fact, the message to the Laodicean church is addressed by someone who's called the Amen, which means let it be so, Lord. And then he's called the faithful and true witness. Why? Because firsthand, he has witnessed what we are going through. He knows the gut-wrenching level of your pain. If there's someone in this room today that has been carrying that load way too long, I want you to know Christ has gone to the level of your pain. He has gone there and experienced it as a human being. So he is the wonderful counselor. And do you know what? He's also the mighty God. And this is the title given to Jesus. He's called the mighty God because he's big enough for any problem that you are carrying. He is big enough to match the adversary. He is big enough to take on whatever you have no solution for if you are willing to let go of control. If you are willing to say, yes, God, I will let you have my life, he will be big enough to solve that problem. I challenge you today to stop trying to do it on your own. The Everlasting Father is a title given to Jesus Christ. Was he actually a father? Did he father children? In the book of Isaiah, it talks about him. Who can see his generation? Right? He didn't have a generation because he died childless. He was born and he did not marry and he did not have children. But I want to tell you, every one of you in this room are a child of God. And he has taken you up, and he is your everlasting Father. And whatever message you may have been given by a twisted, wounded man called your father, if that is the way your father was, I want you to know that Jesus would like to stand at your right hand, and he would like to address your father and say, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Or my daughter, in whom I am well pleased. And he will give an answer to every accusation and every twisted message you've ever had in your life. And this afternoon we're going to talk about that. And I want to give you the gift of the Father's validation. I don't want you to miss it. If you've never had the Father's validation, I want you to be there this afternoon. The last title and the last step in healing, because I'm describing emotional healing to you today, folks. The last step is peace. I tell you, not one of you needs to have anxiety. Not one of you needs to worry about tomorrow. Not one of you needs to. If you will give your lives into God's hands, he will give you a peace that passes all understanding. No matter what the crisis is and no matter how difficult it is, we have a loving God who is willing, with his own life on a grinding level of 33 years, culminating in the horrors of crucifixion, he is giving you that gift. Will you accept it today? Will you say, God, I want you to be supreme in my life. I want you to take over. I want you to be in control. You see, the gospel is about Jesus being your Lord as well as your Savior. And he's safe in both roles. Thank you.